Tensions at Morehouse, a historically black college, are escalating as Biden gets closer to delivering the commencement speech there on Sunday. The Biden administration was so concerned with the potential for protests over Biden's handling of the war in Gaza that they sent the head of the White House Office of Public Engagement to meet with a group of students and faculty a week before the speech. Now here's a glimpse of that meeting where a Morehouse student expressed his concerns.
Right now, I'm being told that we need to use our platform as Morehouse men. Why are we using it to support someone who hasn't been supporting Palestine and Gaza and things like that? How are we being global cosmopolitan citizens? What precedent does that set?
Still, the New York Times has insisted anti-war protests haven't happened at Morehouse. The Times published an article recently titled, "Why Anti-War Protests Haven't Flared Up at Black Colleges Like Morehouse," and wrote, quote, "The reasons stem from political, cultural, and socioeconomic differences with other institutions of higher learning. While HBCUs host a range of political views, domestic concerns tend to outweigh foreign policy in the minds of most students. Many started lower on the economic ladder and are more intently focused on their education and their job prospects after graduation." Now we have host of the Sabby Sabs Podcast, Sabrina Salvati, here with us today to talk about why she disagrees with the New York Times' take. She joins us now to discuss. Welcome back to the show, Sabrina.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me on.
So what do you make of this kind of clear contrast between the New York Times' framing of HBU students in particular not having protests, not being as agitated around the Biden administration's handling of the war in Gaza as predominantly white institutions, and what we're clearly seeing in this video where there's enough discord and pushback at Morehouse to require the White House to send an emissary to talk to the students in advance of Biden showing up to do this commencement address?
Well, I think mainstream media has painted this narrative that most of the protesters are just a bunch of rich white kids. That's actually not true. There have been protests at Morehouse that I've covered on the show as well. It's just that mainstream media is choosing not to focus on them, because if they do focus on those protests, then it will actually show people that African Americans have an issue with this as well. And it also reflects on Joe Biden's poor polling right now with the African American community. So they don't want that narrative to get out. But yeah, there is a misconception that all the protesters are just rich white kids, but that is actually not the case. In reference to Morehouse in particular, yes, they did have a meeting with President Thomas, and they did express their opinion about Gaza and the decision of the school to actually have Joe Biden speak at commencement, which they seem to be very much against. It's really interesting to me that Joe Biden feels comfortable coming to an HBCU after he reneged on his promise to actually remove student loan debt for HBCU students for those that earn under $125,000 a year. In particular, Morehouse is in Georgia. So Joe Biden is going back to Georgia, where he promised to give people $2,000 checks if they supported Warnock and Ossoff. So it's really interesting that he's actually willing to take that risk. I think the right thing for the students to do is to protest during the commencement. Now, President Thomas has already announced that if there are going to be protests, that he will cancel commencement. Now, why is that? People have to understand that the presidents of these universities respond to the Board of Trustees. So President Thomas is doing exactly what the Board of Trustees wants him to do. So this is why I continue to say these universities, we have to start calling them businesses. And they have realized that the students are the customers. So the students actually have more power here than they may have realized, but I think they're realizing it now. But I think it is absolutely important that Morehouse students do express their opinion about Joe Biden speaking at commencement. And I think this needs to happen to Joe Biden's face.
Sure. The reason he's speaking there, as you alluded to, is the fact that Georgia is a swing state that he hopes to win, and his approval numbers with black community right now are very, very bad, historically low for Democrats. What does he need to say to a gathering such as this if he wants to improve his standing with a core key constituency?
Well, I can tell you what he doesn't need to say. He doesn't need to say that we have to protect our democracy. He doesn't need to say that if it's me or it's Donald Trump, you're going to end up with Donald Trump again. I don't think the Trump fear-mongering is working with people this time around. And I think Joe Biden needs to focus more on his actions instead of his rhetoric. The president has a tremendous amount of power when it comes to this conflict in Gaza. He can call for an immediate ceasefire tomorrow if he wanted to. And that would actually hold a lot of weight and speak volumes. So the students, I have to say, this younger generation, they're not so much focused on the rhetoric. They're focused on the actions and the behavior. And they've done a lot of research in reference to the Palestinian struggle, in reference to how Israel was created as a state to begin with. So they are very much aware of what is happening there to the people. So Joe Biden can say as much rhetoric as he wants to, but until he actually takes some action and implements a ceasefire, I think the students are not going to buy into that rhetoric.
Yeah, I think the point that you made about the promises that he has reneged upon, specifically for residents of Georgia and Atlanta, is a really important point. Many folks will want to push under the rug the fact that he made a different, bigger promise, frankly, to graduates of HBCUs than his broader kind of student debt mandate, which was he was going to cancel all student debt for HBCU graduates, not just the 10 to 20,000, depending on whether or not you were a Pell Grant recipient. And I do think that given the enormity of that promise, many more Black students are going to have not forgotten it or be less willing to forgive him retracting that promise, not acting upon that promise, than as compared to the broader community. What's interesting, though, to me is what this clear gap. You're hearing, this is from the AP that spoke to some students. One student at Morehouse, a sophomore named Anwar Kareem, said, "This is a global catastrophe in Gaza, and Joe Biden coming to pander for our votes is political blackface." You're getting that kind of rhetoric, that kind of protest coming out of the voices of Black college students, at the same time that you have the New York Times insisting that Black students, unlike their peers at white institutions, are too concerned with their own kind of domestic concerns, socioeconomic concerns, and that they are just not paying as much attention to what's going on in Gaza, when it does really feel like the opposite, frankly, is true, that Black students have been overrepresented, if anything, on campuses, at these campus protests. There was a really viral image of a Black student who was an HBCU student at Emory getting tased by the police some months ago. And I got to ask you, Sabby, are they trying to Bernie bro the pro-Gaza protests?
Right. They're trying to make it seem like younger, Black students are not paying attention to this issue. That is not the case. Every pro-Palestinian protest that I have covered on the ground, there have been Black students there as well. They don't want you to see that. They want you to think that this is just a rich white kid thing that's happening here, but that's not the case. It's similar to the situation where they didn't want people to realize for a long time that a lot of the pro-Palestinian protesters were also kids that were Jewish, right? They want to hide that narrative. They want people to think that everyone is not waking up and is not aware. And I have to let people understand that younger generation, particularly younger Black voters, are less likely to buy into supporting the Democratic Party. They're more willing to support third party or independent candidates. They're less likely to be pro-establishment. They are less likely to buy into the narrative of mainstream media. They're more willing to do their own research and not just take the information that's put out in front of them by outlets like the New York Times. This is a different generation, and this is a new time, and I look forward to it. So I have a lot of hope for the future because of this generation.
Is there any speculation about what will happen when Biden is speaking there? Are there going to be protests or walkouts occurring?
I haven't heard anything yet, but it could be one of those things that they actually keep on the down low and they keep between themselves and just decide to do it at the spur of the moment. Because again, President Thomas did say that if there were protests that he would cancel commencement. So if the students are clever, which I believe they are, they're probably going to keep this among themselves, and then it'll just be something that happens at commencement.
Sabby, if you were Joe Biden, if in some topsy-turvy world you worked for Joe Biden, would you advise him to do this speech?
Well, number one, I would never work for Joe Biden, but if I was in that situation and I had his ear, I would tell him that number one, you need to call for a ceasefire. Number two, you need to stop funding Israel, stop funding Ukraine. And number three, like, you do not need to appear at Morehouse, considering what you have not done for that particular community in reference to the promises that you made to them. That's what I would tell Joe Biden, and then I would resign.
All right, Sabby Sabs, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you.